been on the bench since 2011 and presides over felony criminal cases. She was the chief judge for a 2-year term in 2014 and 2015. She brought the HOPE probation program to Allen Superior Court, which has been instrumental in reducing recidivism by nonviolent low-level drug offenders through positive behavioral change for those under court supervision. She's been committed to the rehabilitation of drug addicts by closely monitoring their addiction treatment while under her jurisdiction and supervision. Through HOPE, any violation while on community supervision results in strict and swift circumstances, which includes hearings in front of Judge Davis for accountability. She's been appointed by the Supreme Court as the current chairperson for the Indiana Judicial Probation Committee, where she continues her work to reduce recidivism around the state. She also promotes and recruits minorities into the legal profession. In 2015, then Governor Mike Pence appointed Judge Davis to the newly established Indiana Governor's Task Force on Drug Enforcement, Treatment, and Prevention, where she, along with other state officials and law enforcement, helped implement a statewide solution to the overall drug epidemic in the state, both judicial and other means of prevention. And in recognition of her contributions to that task force, Governor, now Vice President Pence, presented Judge Davis with Indiana's Distinguished Hoosier Award, and she was subsequently appointed by the Indiana Attorney General, Curtis Hill, to the Attorney General's Drug Abuse Prevention Task Force. She's very active in the local community. She's a current board member of the Allen County Bar Association, past board chair of the United Way of Allen County, a member of Women United. She also serves on the Mayor City United Task Force, the Board of Trustees for Indiana Tech, and the Board of Directors for Youth for Christ of Northeast Indiana. Prior to taking the bench, Judge Davis, who is a native of Allen County, was a partner at the law firm of Beckman Lawson, LLP, specializing in civil, federal litigation, and a part-time deputy prosecutor for Allen County. Prior to moving back to Fort Wayne, Judge Davis served as the assistant district attorney in San Antonio, beautiful city, wish I could live there, wherein she prosecuted violent offenders and gang members and was appointed to a federally funded drug and violent crime task force. She was chosen as one of the few members of the 2010 class of Women of Excellence Indiana Lugar Series and received the Northeast Indiana Women in Leadership Award. Her husband, Scott, is a local physician and a U.S. veteran. And what she's going to share with us today, I think, is a fascinating topic. The title, if I can remember correctly, because I don't have it in front of me, is Separation of Church and State. How does a federal judge take into account or negotiate her faith in her daily decision making? So, without any further ado, would you welcome Judge?
Thank you. It's nice to be here. I think if you get to know me a little bit, I don't know what impression you have of judges. I was on the bench all morning. I am pretty stoic when I'm on the bench, but I'm a human being like everybody else. I see I have friends in the audience too that know me in my private life, so feel free to ask me any questions you want whatsoever. We can make it interactive. How many people are from this area, or from Fort Wayne? Is almost everybody? Okay, great. So I was in Texas for many, many years when my husband was an Army physician, but I went to Homestead High School. Any Homestead High School grads? Oh, one? Just one out of the whole group? All right, so when did you graduate? 2013. 2013, okay. Well, I graduated way before that, but anyway. So I know he just read you my bio. How many here are interested in law, going to law school, really? Just one? All right. So what are some of the majors? So how many are in the constitutional class right now? So many of you. And why are you taking? Let me just ask, why are you taking the class? I mean, do you have to have it for prerequisite for something? And what's your major?
General Studies.
General Studies. Okay. Who else? Who else is in the constitution class? And what is your major?
History education.
Same. Okay, I'm just trying to get a feel of the audience and who's all here. I would encourage you maybe to think about law. I mean, if you're in constitutional classes, Believe it or not, like any other profession, the law is on a downswing a little bit right now, which means lawyers are very sought after. Young lawyers are getting snatched up and getting jobs like crazy. So anyway, just I promote being a lawyer because we always need really good lawyers out there. When I was asked to talk today, and when I was kind of thinking of, well, what am I going to talk about? What would really be an interesting topic to talk about in a religion forum? And I get asked a question, people that really know me, I mean, I'm just going to put it out there. I'm a strong Christian. I mean, that's my faith. That's what I believe in 100%. I believe that Jesus is our Lord, and Christ died on the cross for me to live eternally. And not everybody in this world believes that. I profess it. I can come to a forum like this, thankfully, and I can talk about it. But a lot of different there's so many different religions in our country right now and around the globe. And I tell people all the time, if you come and sit on one of my juries, I start the same way every single time. When I start a jury trial, I welcome the jury in and I say, okay, I want you to know right now where I'm coming from. We live in the best country in the world. The United States of America, by far, is the best country. Now, I'm not talking about politics or political unrest, because if you watch the news at all, you know that we've got some pretty harsh divides with Republicans and Democrats and libertarians. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this document we have called the Constitution of the United States of America. It drives my job. I take an oath to uphold it, and I take that oath very seriously. So I tell people, how many of you have had jury duty before? Has anybody in the room had jury duty? Really, quite a few of you. Okay. So oftentimes, you get that jury notice in the mail, and you go, oh, how do I get out of jury duty, right? And I would encourage you not to think that way, because in America, with this live document called the Constitution, the beauty of it is that if you get arrested for any kind of crime, whether or not I just presided over a murder case this morning. So they have the same Constitution attached to them as a traffic ticket. And so I don't think people in America understand that if you get arrested for a crime, it is a privilege that you are innocent till proven guilty. 100% innocent. You have the right to remain, you watch TV, right? You have the right to remain silent. If you don't have a lawyer, I'm the person that appoints you one. I'll appoint you a lawyer. So anyway, I tell people about the Constitution only because I believe wholeheartedly that when I took an oath to uphold that Constitution, that is something that I think sometimes we as Americans take for granted. Because the freedoms that we have, the privileges that we have, they all come from that one document. So that's how come the document is so extremely important. So let's talk a little bit. I just told you that I profess that I am a Christian, that I believe in the Lord Jesus Christ, and the only way I get to heaven is to believe on him. I can't do anything to earn my way into heaven. That is the way I believe, and that is my faith. So if my faith is that strong, and the way I believe I should live my life, that doesn't mean I do it all the time, but if that is who I am, how in the world do I take a job where I follow the Constitution of the state of Indiana and the Constitution of the United States that basically dictates to me that I have to separate out my faith and my job, right? So let's just go back a little bit and do a history lesson. All right. Does anybody know where the phrase separation of church and state came from? Is that in the Constitution? No, you don't get to, the professor does not get to answer the question. Yes, so is separation of church and state, is that quote, is that in the Constitution?
Isn't it from a letter Jefferson wrote to a group of Baptist preachers?
You guys are really good. Yes, that's exactly right. So that's where the concept was originated. And since that time, when Jefferson wrote that letter to the Baptist Association, and it's a very celebrated letter, so I can tell you guys have been studying this. That issue of separation of church and state has become an impassioned debate, I will tell you, especially in the different branches of government, right? So let's talk, there's the executive branch of government, legislative, and judicial. I'm in the judicial branch of government. And what do you often hear? So many times when you hear senators, they'll come out and say, I'm pro-life or I'm pro-choice, right? Those are hot button issues. A lot of other issues too is, should there be more government or less government? And oftentimes you hear legislators talk about why they believe that way. You hear our current president right now talk about God and putting God back into so many things that the country has taken out. And I'm not here to agree or disagree with any of that, okay? I'm here saying, you know, that's just kind of the culture and the landscape that we see our country in. So in the judicial branch of government, I have very strict guidelines of what my job is. I take an oath to follow the law. The Constitution of the United States is the law. In the Constitution, we have, okay, so separation of church and state, that quote, you're right, it came from a letter back, Jefferson in 1802. But where does it establish in the Constitution the fact that the separation of church and state, what is the parts of the Constitution that outline, that Jefferson was referring to when he talks about separation of church and state? Yes, sir.
The First Amendment or the Bill of Rights?
Yep. You're 100% correct. So the first thing we look to is the First Amendment. And what does the First Amendment say? Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So those are known as the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause, right? So we've got these two clauses, Establishment Clause and Free Exercise Clause, that come directly from the First Amendment. In fact, they come directly from one sentence that says, and I'm going to read it again, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Now, since the First Amendment came to be, there has been a multitude of discussion and debate about the separation of church and state. To give you a further history lesson, so as you know, the Constitution of the United States applies to every state, all 50 states. You may or may not know this, but every state has their own constitution. So when I do jury instructions, when I instruct a jury, when I perform my job every single day, there are two huge documents that I have to be aware of at all times. The Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the state of Indiana. Historically, believe it or not, in the 1800s, many of those constitutional states, the states that have their own constitution, there were some states that said you could not run for public office unless you were Catholic. There were other states that said, I think North Carolina was a pretty celebrated case, where North Carolina's constitution said you had to be a Protestant if you wanted to run for public office. Now keep in mind, this is all post First Amendment stuff, really. I mean, all of these cases that I'm talking to you about. So what happened? Well, that's where the judicial branch of government comes in. The Supreme Court made it very, very clear that that was unconstitutional. So now all of the constitutions in all 50 states currently in 2018 have adopted the same clause as the First Amendment, or the separation of church and state clause, as we call it, free exercise and establishment. So what that means is anybody who is in public office has to keep separated their beliefs from their job. But it also means that you can't prohibit anybody from taking the bench, right, because I'm an elected official, taking the bench or being elected if you're an atheist or if you're a Christian, if you're Jewish or if you're Muslim. One of the beautiful things about our country and about the United States of America is that we have all these freedoms, and it's all derived from the Constitution of the United States. So you have the freedom to worship however you want to worship. You have the freedom to be Muslim. You have the freedom to be a Jew. You have the freedom to do whatever you want to do. And so if you decide to take the bench one day, I think probably judges in my world, we're more scrutinized than anybody about keeping separated our faith and religion from the decisions we make. And that is because the law tells me that I have to keep those separate. I have to. So what does that really look like? So you heard my biography. I preside over criminal felony cases. And I'm going to carve out one particular type of case that this is really applicable to. I preside over all the felony drug cases that happen in Allen County. I'll be honest with you, the law is pretty clear that if you're convicted of murder, rape, child molest, those kind of things, I mean, that's kind of easy decision making for a judge like me. Where I get to have more discretion, where the law allows me to have more discretion in my decision making, typically are in the drug cases. So for instance, I'm going to give you an example. The 14th, let's just talk a minute about the 14th Amendment too, because you can't really talk about the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause unless you talk about the 14th Amendment, which is really probably the biggest amendment that affects me every single day. Why is that? What's the 14th Amendment? What's the 14th Amendment? Have you guys studied that yet?
The states have to abide by the federal constitution.
Yep, that's in the 14th Amendment. But more importantly, think about what I do every day. If you're arrested, let's say, like this guy this morning, he was arrested for murder, and he's innocent till proven guilty. What is my job in all of that? What does the 14th Amendment drive? Due process. So really, that's, as a judge, we make sure that everybody gets due process. You know, you look around the globe, and around the globe, so many of the countries that you see, especially like in the Middle East, and I'm not saying they're good or bad, I'm just telling you the facts. If you're arrested, you are automatically guilty. Boom, you're arrested, you're guilty. And you got to go into court and you have to prove your innocence. Not so in the United States of America, because we have this lovely thing called the Constitution, and contained in that is the 14th Amendment, which says you have due process and you are innocent until proven guilty. That's where all that comes from. And so in that 14th Amendment, the due process and the protection clauses is what protects everybody from the states' rights, that gives them the rights of the Constitution. But in the 14th Amendment, it talks long and hard about due process. And that's where it starts to evolve about the judges, right? So in decision making every day, if I am told through the First Amendment and through the Due Process Clause that I have to separate out my faith from what I'm doing, what does that really look like? Because, and I'm going to explain it to you here in a minute. Now, one of the court cases I did bring, I pulled it because it's, did you guys study the Lemon case at all? The Lemon case? The U.S. Constitution? Okay.
We're going to get to it next Monday.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give you a little precursor. So here's your extra credit. Okay. So the Lemon case was really specifically, I think, a roadmap for someone like me who is a judge. And I'm going to read this to you, okay? And this is what the court held in that U.S. case about separation of church and state. Our prior holdings, now this is the Supreme Court talking, our prior holdings do not call for total separation between church and state. Total separation is not possible in an absolute sense. Some relationship between government and religious organizations are inevitable. Judicial caveats against entanglement must recognize that the line of separation, far from being a wall, is blurred, indistinct, and a variable barrier depending on the circumstances of a particular relationship. Basically, the Lemon test goes on to tell someone like myself the roadmap I should use. First, the law or policy must have been established and adopted with neutral, non-religious purpose. That doesn't affect me. That's the legislator. All the legislation that goes on in the legislative branch of government, I think that's more applicable to them, meaning any law or policy that's being adopted or passed in Congress has to be neutral with a non-religion purpose. The second principle, which I feel is highly applicable to the judiciary, says the principle or primary effect, meaning whatever sentence, whatever effect I give, must be one that neither advances or inhibits religion. And then the third in the Lemon test is the statute or policy must not result in an excessive entanglement of government and religion. So let me give you an example of how I interpret this and what I do. So with these drug cases, oftentimes they're sad. I mean, they're sad, and even as a human being, I have a black robe on, but I still have to listen to their stories. I hear daily stories, and how we deal with them in Superior Court is I bifurcate out my drug cases versus my violent offenders. So I put my violent offenders in kind of a different category. Evidence-based practices tell us to do so. My drug offenders, which are usually non-violent, low-level felony offenders, heroin, opiates, methamphetamine, marijuana, drinking, those offenders I treat very differently, and I have some locked-in discretion. And so let me give you a for instance. I had an individual who was a Trine athlete. He was on full scholarship at Trine for lacrosse. Really talented lacrosse player. Well, he got injured and injured over and over again, and then had multiple surgeries here in town. And he was given a prescription for opiates. Well, I won't belabor the story, but long story short, he ended up locked up in the Allen County Jail, sitting in front of me, self-reporting he has been sticking a needle in his arm for the past 3 years after dropping out of Trine, shooting heroin. So what do I do with an individual like that, and how does my faith come through in something like that? The law says that he's been found guilty of a level 6 felony, possession of heroin. It's a felony. Now, if you hear the term felon, that kind of can send shivers up your spine, right? I mean, because they're felons. Would y'all look at this person, this Trine athlete? My faith tells me that I need to show God's love and God's grace, right? The law tells me I have a wide discretion on what to do with this individual and how to sentence him. The law tells me I can release him to community supervision, or I can keep him locked up because he's a felon. So here is where I believe the second principle, principle of this test comes in, wherein the principle or primary effect must be one that's neither advances or inhibits a religion. So this individual, a lot of the sober living environments that we have in Fort Wayne, Indiana, are faith-based. Meaning, if you go into a sober living environment or you go into a halfway house, I can court order you in there, that's up to me. And they're faith-based, meaning part of their recovery is to go to classes like Celebrate Recovery and to learn true restoration comes in Christ. So I have the ability under the law to put him in a sober living halfway house. The laws allow me to put him into those sober living halfway houses, and it shouldn't inhibit or advance any faith-based intent these halfway houses may have. Now I'm going to tell you, a lot of the halfway houses I use, their intent is to get them clean and sober, give them through counseling and services, and to get them to know the Lord. Here is a specific circumstance, and I've done my research, so I know I went all the way up to my Supreme Court to make sure I wasn't breaking any laws, that I am allowed to release these individuals into these halfway houses, and I tell them they're faith-based, but the faith-based part of that halfway house and their services is voluntary. So as a judge, I am allowed, because I believe, my personal belief that I have to keep separated from the law, my personal belief is I think true restoration comes through the power of Christ Jesus. However, I have to keep that separate. So when I release them to these places, here is the discretion and the guidance I get in the law. It shouldn't inhibit or promote, right? But if it's voluntary, I'm going to tell you what often happens is these individuals go into the halfway house and they don't have to attend the church part of it. They don't have to attend the Bible study part of it. But by the end of it, I have found that the faith part of it shines through in those halfway houses, and these individuals come out on the other side, not only clean and sober, but knowing the Lord. And I'm just being honest, right? Now, I make sure they understand, though, I'm not promoting it. That's up to them. It's voluntary. So I'm going to tell you where my Trine athlete is now. He's working full-time. He just got married, excuse me, attending a local church with his new wife. He's a strong Christian, and he sometimes I can get him to talk about it. He's kind of shy, so he doesn't like to talk about it. But there's an example of how I followed the law strictly. I put him in a place that offered that. He took advantage of it, and he'll tell me to his benefit. So although I have to keep the separation, I never talk about my faith from the bench, ever. I'm allowed to do it today because I'm not on the bench, I'm not in the courtroom, I don't have my black robe on, and I'm at a religious forum, right? And you know, a religious forum, you know, the beautiful thing about this is tomorrow you might have another speaker that talks about being a Muslim in Islam. And that's the lovely thing about America and the freedoms that we hold, is that you can have all kinds of speakers come in here and tell you how they believe and what they believe in. But as long as I keep it separate from what I do in that courtroom, then I'm following the Constitution to a T. However, my faith can shine in so many different ways when I show grace to a drug-addicted offender and say, I'm going to give you a chance to get clean and sober. Now, I will have to tell you, I'm kind of a stickler. Like, if they don't follow my rules and what I court order them to do, then I penalize them. I'm not a social worker. That's one thing I'm not. I am a judge. So I think that my faith can come through and not disrupt the separation of church and state by showing people grace, showing people mercy, people that, you know, I mean, it is a little bit different because there are consequences to, one thing about the criminal law, there are consequences. The laws are very clear as to what those consequences are if you hurt the community or do anything that would go against those laws. And I enforce those laws 100%. But there are many ways that I believe that the laws allow me to bring in my particular faith as long as it doesn't promote or hinder any type of faith. I just give them the opportunity. If they take the opportunity, that's up to them. But that's allowed. Any questions so far? I will tell you, I won't go to 1:15. I know how you guys are, because you guys watch the clock. It's almost worse than church, right? Any questions so far? No? All right. Let me touch just a little teeny bit. Yes, go ahead.
I'm just curious on why you decided to become a judge. You still believe in the same Jesus who said, "Thou shalt not judge"?
Right. That's true. But that's a little bit different. And that's funny you asked me that, because I have jurors come in that say I can't sit as a juror because my religion says I can't judge anybody. But let me tell you, I do think that thou that shalt not judge means the heart. It means I'm not going to judge your heart. That doesn't mean if you go break a law in my community and hurt my community, there's not a penalty for that. I am there to ensure that the laws of the state of Indiana and the laws of the federal government are upheld 100%. So I believe that God tells me not to. That doesn't mean, just because you're convicted, even this individual, believe it or not, that's convicted of murder, I'm not judging his heart. I'm judging his actions. I gave him due process under the 14th Amendment. I gave him his right to speak. I gave him a lawyer. I gave him everything that he needed. But there are consequences. I think the Bible's pretty clear that there are consequences to all of our actions. But that doesn't mean you can't be redeemed from them. That's not my job. My job is to follow the law, and that law says there's consequences. I'm not going to label you as a horrible person. I think that's where the judging comes in from God. But that's my personal view. Does that make sense to you? You don't look like, does that make sense?
Sort of.
Well, I want to make it really clear, because people have asked me that before. When God says, "Thou shalt not judge," I'm not going to judge why he did it. I'm not going to judge how he did it. I'm not going to judge what made him do it. I'm going to decide if I give him all his constitutional rights to due process and a jury finds him guilty, I'm going to sentence him under the law. But I'm not going to judge his heart. That's for God to do. It's the best answer I got for you. Any other questions? Yes?
When you said that most of the people that you send come away knowing faith,
Most of them, yeah.
What percent would that be, you say?
So I will tell you that, a little bit of a side note, in our criminal justice system, we are drinking out of a fire hose right now with the opiate crisis. You know, you hear about the opiate crisis and you hear about the drugs. Oftentimes, believe it or not, they've done a study that people really don't get help if you're an addicted individual. A lot of people struggle with addictions. But they did a study, and especially here in the state of Indiana, because of the judiciary, because we've taken such an active role in true rehabilitation. They've done a study that a lot of people don't really get rehabilitated unless they get arrested and come through the criminal justice system. So to your point, how many people, wait, is your question how many people get clean or how many people come to the Lord? You know, I don't know all of that because, again, that's a heart issue. Who am I to judge that, right? That's between them and God. I can only tell you the stories when they graduate off my program, Clean and Sober. They'll usually tell me that they couldn't do it without God or they couldn't do it without the Holy Spirit making them strong. And I never comment on it in the courtroom ever. Quietly in my heart, I'd say, yep, I told you so, but you know what I mean? But I never comment on those kind of comments, so I can't really gauge the percentage. I had another girl, when I first took the bench in 2011, I actually sent her to prison, and she was a methamphetamine addict. And her name, I can tell you her name because she talks about it all the time. She's a public speaker now. But she grew up in a world of drugs. She remembers being 7 years old, trying to find something to eat in her house. No one would take her to school. Her mom and dad were strung out on drugs. And so she grew up in that environment. And by the time she got in front of me, she had committed, and she was nonviolent, but the law at that time, because she had committed so many drug offenses, I sent her to prison. She went to the women's prison for a year and a half, and I modified her out because she did a bunch of services. But anyway, so she went into a halfway house here locally called the Redemption House. I don't know if you've heard of the Redemption House, but they are a faith-based halfway house that has been certified by the Supreme Court that I can use them. So it's not just I decide, but I get the halfway houses certified, and to make sure that I don't want to do anything I'm not supposed to do. The law is too important. But the Redemption House is faith-based. They do Celebrate Recovery there. They do Bible studies there. I tell the women when I send them there, you don't have to participate in any of that, but you have to follow the house rules as far as, taking a urine. They have to take urine screens almost every day, drop, that kind of thing. And if they're dirty, they have to come back in front of me. But they have to follow all the rules of the house, and the carve-out is they don't have to do the Bible study part. But, the women that run that house that's been certified by the Supreme Court, they are such strong Christians, they tend to just love on these women, right? God's grace. They love on these women to where they... So anyway, long story short, Marissa now runs her own halfway house. She's been out of prison, let's see, that was 2011. So I actually took her out 2013. She went to Redemption House about 2013, 14, 15. 2015, she graduated from the house. And so now she will tell you that she didn't know the Lord before all of this happened with the addicted lifestyle. She does now, and she says it's by His grace that So those are the stories I can tell you. I don't really know a percentage because I don't ask. If they offer it to me, I will listen, but I don't ask. Because again, I have to be cognizant of the separation of church and state.
So you said you take the violent crimes and the drug offenses and sort them out.
Yes.
Can you elaborate on how you treat those differently?
Yeah, I can. So if you are, believe it or not, the judges try to be as objective as possible when determining what type of criminal you are for sentencing. So evidence-based practices tell us that we need to separate out our non-violent offenders from our violent offenders. And the reason for that, just a little bit of background, is it's always inevitable. It's like the older brother and the innocent son, right? The older brother is going to go, come on, and the innocent brother. The older brother is going to influence this little brother. They've used that analogy in the criminal justice system for a violent offender and the non-violent offender, the drug-addicted. Drug-addicted offenders usually have a lot of shame. They usually have, they're very quiet. They don't have a lot of hope. The violent offenders, when they do a study on them, they may have no hope either, but they're not shameful about it usually. I mean, some are, but the studies that they have done. So we keep them separated because we don't want the violent offenders to get a hold of the the non-violent offenders and have them do their dirty work, or usually what it shows is that the violent offenders will affect the non-violent offenders instead of the non-violent offenders affecting the violent offenders, like, hey, don't be violent anymore. Does that make sense? So what is your name? Jaden. Jaden what? Jaden Evans. So Jaden, if you were charged and convicted of murder, I would call you Mr. Evans. And I would be very stoic. And I would do my job and I would follow it to the T. And if you were convicted, I would sentence you accordingly. If you're a nonviolent offender, I have a grace hat on that's a little bit bigger, meaning I usually will call you Jaden. I'm like, good morning, Jaden. I usually try to show you a lot more respect because, and that's been taught to me. This is not a Wendy thing. This is not a Judge Davis thing. They teach us this at judge school, believe it or not, on how to be a really effective decision maker. And so the drug addicted offenders who have been arrested are usually rock bottom. They've usually lost all their family. They have so much shame and they feel like nobody cares. So in lieu of calling them Mr. Evans and putting on my stoic face and hat, I call you Jacob. And I say, Jacob, what's going on? What's happening to you? You know, is this what you want? And usually you'll tell me no. And so when I release you on a program to try to get you clean and sober, I guarantee you, if you are a really addicted offender, you're gonna relapse. And when you relapse, I put you back in jail. And you come back and talk to me, and I don't scold you. I say, what happened? What is going on that is making you relapse? And so it's a very different relationship between the judge and the offender with the nonviolent drug cases versus the violent offenders, because a lot of times the violent offenders, they don't like me anyway, and they don't have good things to say to me when they come. I hold a lot of contempt proceedings, you know, that they're like, F you on the way out the door, and I'm like, bring them back. Whoosh. And I'm like, you know, I'm gonna hold you in contempt again. Now you're gonna sit in 30 days in solitary confinement. You know what I mean? Like, they're just a different type of individual. They are. I mean, that's the reality of my life. So they're a different type of individual, so the evidence-based practices tell us judges we need to treat them differently, because drug offenses, you really can truly rehabilitate somebody if they want that help, where sometimes the violent offenders, they don't want that help. And so it's a different way of talking to them. It's a good question, though. Does that help? I'm trying to put some the way I'm talking to you guys today, I'm trying to put some humanness on a lot of this. But because I am here to talk about separation of church and state, never will you hear me talk about the Lord or God from my mouth on the bench, ever. Will I give you an opportunity to find him? Yes, and that's allowed under the laws. Any other questions? I really don't have much more for you, other than, I mean, I can sit up here and tell you war stories all day. That's what every time I go talk to young kids, that's what they want to hear. Yes, sir?
Ken, maybe gear up, because we're going to be talking about Ingleby Vital.
Okay.
So, and I hear people all the time say, oh, our society just really went down the tubes the day we got prayer out of the public schools. It's kind of a hot button issue. So,
like I said, this particular issue, the separation of church and state, I mean, the only way I can categorize it is to call it an impassioned debate that has been going on forever. So is your question to me?
Students are always interested in what I think, and they might be interested in what you think about that particular
Prayer in school?
And that particular issue.
So if I were queen for the day and I could make all the laws, the way I understand the First Amendment, right, is you have the right, the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause say, I am free to exercise my religion in whatever way, however I want to do it. So I do believe, though, that it's a little bit different when you're the teacher versus the student. It's like me being a judge. If I strictly follow the Constitution of the United States, I don't believe it's correct under our Constitution for a teacher to start school with a Christian prayer. Let me put it a different way. Let's say you are a Christian. What if you had a Muslim teacher that said everybody get down before school and pray to Allah, right? So I am pretty much a raw constitutionalist. I don't always like my decisions, but I will tell you, I think that prayer in school should be allowed for the students. If the students want to stop and pray, stop and pray. It shouldn't be disruptive to the class. It should not make a big scene. But I think that that's definitely something that should be, and I think it should be more, you know, if you are free that you want to stop and pray, but you can't disrupt the class, or you can't be treated differently. I know in the school that my kids attend, there's one boy in my son's class that they are very hard and fast Islamic Muslims, and he goes into the principal's office. He separates himself from the class, goes into the principal's office. They have a little place for him to go pray 5 times a day. I do believe that the Constitution also tells us that we have to make accommodations for those religions. I mean, that's pretty established, right? I mean, we've got we've got all kinds of laws enacted that the Supreme Court has upheld that says you must give a religious accommodation, right? It's almost like, you know, sometimes, so if that's the case, I do think the students should have that freedom and that right. However, I don't think that the teachers or the leaders in charge in a public school should be able to open the class with prayer. That is not that's not a Judge Davis opinion. That is my pure reading of the Constitution. So it is a very big hot button issue, I know. I mean, now my kids go to a private school, so when we made that application to the Muslim individual, I do think that that is supported by our Constitution to allow him to be bifurcated out and go and pray and come back. He's not doing it in the center of class, being disruptive. But I think it gets a lot harder when the leaders who are the ones that enforce, like a teacher, right? You enforce the laws of the school. You enforce the decorum of the classroom. You just can't have a free-for-all. And I don't think the teacher should be the one to stand up and pray. I know that historically, you know, that has been so. I will tell you one thing I do believe in, though. I still believe, when I grew up, even in grade school, you know, we would stand up and pledge allegiance to the flag as a classroom. I don't know why they've abolished that. I mean, if you're a United States citizen and you're here in the United States, I think our Constitution supports that, being able to do that. But I think political views have made their way into some of the constitutionality of what we do in our schools. So as much as I don't believe that teachers should stand up and pray, I do believe the Constitution supports the Pledge of Allegiance. But I'm not a politician. That's just my interpretation of the law. Yes, ma'am?
Even on the pledge now, it says we're a nation under God.
Uh-huh.
How is that different from saying a prayer?
Well, if you want to know my interpretation of that, don't you think every religion that I know of worships some sort of God? One nation under God. Could be Allah, it could be Christ, it could be whoever, it could be Jesus. It doesn't specifically say who that God is. I had a law clerk that was Muslim, and I'm only bringing up Muslims because him and I used to talk about this all the time. We used to talk about all these because he was pro Pledge of Allegiance because we had these talks before, and I said, but Allah is your God. He goes, but that's my God. So I think that anybody, now if you're atheist, I suppose you might have a better argument there, but I'm just telling you my reading of the Constitution. We do live in the United States, so when we pledge allegiance to the United States as a citizen, we're saying I pledge to follow the laws of the state. Yes, ma'am.
Now, the Constitution, doesn't that give us freedom of religion, not freedom from religion?
Yes, but you can still be an atheist. Religion. One of the things that if you study the cases from the Supreme Court, because in law school we had to do this, and when I became a judge, you know, we go through a lot of schooling, believe it or not, continuing legal education as judges. So we discuss these issues a lot as the judiciary to ensure that we are purely following the laws and interpreting them as they were meant. But there has been such an evolution of atheism and that exact issue. I mean, that's it's a great question. That because there were some states, remember when I was talking about the Constitution, there were some states that then said, okay, we'll take out, you can run for public office if you're a Catholic. I think it was the North Carolina state that said, we'll take out that you have to be Protestant, but they left in, however, you cannot run if you're an atheist, okay? And later the Supreme Court said, no, 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 no. It's all religions, and if you're atheist, the Supreme Court had a big dialogue about that's a type of religion as well. So it's a lot of legal analysis when you read these cases, but I'm a trial court judge, so if the Supreme Court makes a decision telling me I need to categorize atheism as a religion or not a religion, it's just it's a belief pattern, I have to uphold that. Yes, sir?
What do you think about religious exemption laws, like the Hobby Lobby case, situations like that?
So the Hobby Lobby case, again, is controversial. And just so you know how judges work, I can tell you my opinion as Wendy, As a judge, I support whatever the opinion is because I'm a trial court judge, right? So trial court judges follow the higher courts. That's the way the Constitution is said. If you're asking me, I guess, an intellectual question about the Hobby Lobby case, I think I would have to agree with it. You know, that case was really controversial because of the contraception, right? And, you know, Catholics, and I'm not Catholic, but I have a lot of Catholic friends who have explained it to me, and I respect that. However, I think that we kind of get into, you have to be careful. Again, what did this lemon test say? You can't prohibit religion, but you can't exclude it either, right? So I do think the Hobby Lobby case was probably the right decision, even though it's highly controversial. Again, I support the decision because that's when again, another good example of my separating my faith from my state job. So the separation of church and state, my answer to you is, I've actually read the opinion, and it's a really well thought out opinion, tracking the Constitution, and I have to say I agree with it. When I say agree with it, I agree with the analysis of it. I don't necessarily agree with the issue, but I agree with the analysis. And I think good judges take their private thought out of it. Really good judges don't put in their own, however I feel or however I believe. I got to keep that out of it and strictly read the Constitution. Yes, sir.
What would you do if you had to make a morally repugnant sentence, like you had to uphold Buck v. Bell?
You got to explain that to me a little bit more. Morally, yeah.
Repulsive, I guess you could say. Like Buck v. Bell upholding.
I don't know Buck v. Bell. You're going to have to...
Oh, it's the law, Supreme Court law that says the state can sterilize an individual if they feel...
I haven't read those. Yeah, I'm a criminal judge now. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah, so it said, it was Virginia, so individual was supposed to had produced like 2-3 generations of unworthy offspring, and the court said that the state has the right to sterilize them to end them, with the most famous statement coming out from it was, 3 generations of imbeciles is enough.
Didn't that case get overturned though? Yeah. That case is not good law. Well, I'm just saying it's good, but you know, our history has shown that courts have made bad decisions and bad law. Courts have overturned decisions, and that one was overturned because you can't do it anymore. Yeah. Did I answer your question? But are you asking me what I would do? Yeah. I would hope I would strictly follow the Constitution. There's a term called stare decisis. Have you guys talked about that? So I'm a trial court judge, so stare decisis tells me that all the court cases that have been, that have established common law or interpretation of the Constitution, I have to follow those laws. If I disagree with those laws, I shouldn't be a trial court judge, I should be an appellate court judge. I don't want to be an appellate court judge because I like sitting on the bench being in the trenches every day. But an appellate court and a Supreme Court, whatever they decide, the trial court is supposed to follow those laws. That's called stare decisis. So if I was asked to make a decision like that, I'm going to hope my colleagues ahead of me has already figured out the kind of decision. If I heard that kind of case and you got to sterilize this person, I'm going to say, no, the law is well settled. Like, how many times do you hear judges say the law is well settled? That's usually, they're talking about stare decisis. It's well settled, it's been litigated, and here is the law. So if that comes in front of me, I got the law to follow, and I'll follow it. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay. Did you have another question?
I guess are judges allowed to exempt themselves from like criminal cases where like they think it's immoral? Like for example, if it was like capital punishment was on the table, the judge was categorically against capital punishment, are they allowed?
If capital punishment is on the table and you are a criminal court judge, you should not be a criminal court judge if you have to recuse yourself from that. Because it's a great question. When I was running in my first election, I would get people all the time. I was in a pretty contested race. And we run nonpartisan as judges, you know, so I'm sure you can ferret out what my party is, but I keep it out, right? And someone, I can't tell you how many times I would be in debates or forum with the guy I was running against, that people go, I have a question. Do you believe capital punishment is right? Do you think it's fair? Should we have capital punishment? I got all kinds of, right? My answer was the same each and every time. As a judge, I take an oath to uphold the law. If capital punishment is the law in the state of Indiana, which it is, I make an oath, or I take an oath to follow that law. It is immaterial what my personal beliefs are, right? Again, that's a perfect example. That question is a great example of the separation of church and state. Because it doesn't matter what Wendy thinks. What matters is what is the law. And if the law says it's allowed, then I have to uphold that law. And I tell people, they didn't like that answer because they really wanted to get to the root of whether or not I believed. And then, I mean, I'll be really honest, they asked me a follow-up. Someone had done enough research on me. When I was an assistant district attorney in San Antonio, I worked on capital cases. And so someone asked me, well, didn't you convict somebody of capital murder when you were in Texas? And my response is no. I was the prosecutor. The jury convicted him. So I presented the evidence to the jury, and they convicted him. So I think that you have to be kind of careful because I will say, though, if you really, really, really feel strongly, like for instance, if I felt really strongly that marijuana should be legalized, right? That is such a hot button issue right now. It's legalized in Michigan, it's legalized in Colorado. But if I really, really felt like I'm gonna make decisions from my bench in Indiana because I think marijuana should be legalized, I should be kicked off the bench because that is not my job. I have to separate out my personal beliefs from the laws, and I have to continually remind my young offenders on probation that marijuana is still illegal in Indiana because they'll come in, I'll have 21-year-olds that'll come in, they're on felony probation, they're doing pretty good, and they'll test dirty for marijuana. So they'll come back in front of me and they'll be like, Judge Davis, it was only marijuana. And I usually remand them into custody and just sit them down for a minute, and I'm like, all right, are we talking, it's illegal, you can't do that, and I let them go. But that's the job, but I'm just telling you, that is the law, whether I agree with it or not, that is the law. So. But that's a good question. The capital punishment case has come up a lot because, especially if people know my religious beliefs, because they're like, how can you do that? It's the law. I take an oath to follow the law. But typically in capital cases, it is never, in any state across the U.S., so a little fun fact, never, ever, ever does the judge determine capital. If someone is sentenced to death, it comes from a jury of your peers, of 12 peers. And those 12 people go back and deliberate and decide. There's not one state that allows a judge to determine that individually. Make sense? Yeah.
So in that case, you have good legal precedent in the law itself to rely on, but
in which case?
I'm sorry?
In which case?
In the cases of capital punishment.
Yeah, right.
That's a non-issue for you.
Right.
But in the cases of sentencing, particularly with your drug offenders, you have more latitude in what decision you can make. And so the law does allow you either to put them into custody or to put them into treatment. And I just want to say that I appreciate that you're opting for the treatment option on more cases than not. And in Ben's introduction to you, you're also interested in reducing recidivism. And we know that incarcerating drug offenders, nonviolent drug offenders, is likely to create recidivism down the road.
Correct.
So my question is, in what ways might you approach that sentencing from a particular moral standpoint or religious value standpoint? Does that inform your preference over one route or another in terms of sentencing?
Well, let me answer it two ways. Number one, I try really, really hard, I think I do a really good job of keeping my religious beliefs out of the courtroom. But the way I believe, I can't erase them from who I am, because the way I believe is Christ lives in me, so everything I do is for him, or, right? And so I have heard that that I never say a word about my faith, but I've had so many offenders' families come back later and say, it's so clear that you know the Lord. I don't know that, so hopefully that's the Holy Spirit living in me. But when I go to deal with those drug-addicted offenders, I think the only way I can see my faith maybe creeping in and what they see when I get told that is that I have a lot more mercy for them. I know that they're just hurting individuals. You know, addiction is a disease. Addiction is something that, you know, I mean, I can tell you stories upon stories about, I have 2 kids in college and I still have one still in school. And I mean, I sometimes get off the bench and my knees buckle on the day that I do my drug cases, because trying to make really good, wise decisions when now the way the laws are written because of the drug crisis, the laws give me so much discretion on those low-level offenders of how to sentence them. And you never know really which offenders are low-level nonviolent offenders, because oftentimes they're running around with seedy people, and you know, maybe they're going to be, you know, I'm just waiting for one offender that I release. I will tell you a story, like with the drug offenders too, that scares me sometimes. Is I had a guy that I released on my program, heroin addict. He relapsed and then ran out of money, so he you know, ran into somebody's house trying to steal money from them. So now it's a burglary. Well, the homeowner ended up shooting him. And so, you know, they didn't charge the homeowner, but it's those kind of stories that I kicked myself, because I'm like, maybe he wasn't quite ready to be released yet. So I have to sometimes what I will do is I have to figure out where they stand in their addiction. We don't have any inpatient treatment for offenders, so I have to detox them in the Allen County Jail, which they hate. I know they hate it. So sometimes if I release them too soon, they go right back to the needle. So, you know, there's just such a wide discretion. Sometimes I just wake up in the morning and go, Lord, give me the wisdom I need today to make wise decisions on the things that I have discretion on. You know, because if I release someone and they hurt themselves, or I released a girl, this is so sad. She was a senior at Concordia, and I released her, and I do home visits on my staff. My probation officers and my community corrections officers do home visits on my drug-addicted offenders, because I want to make sure they're, you know, in a sober living environment, that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing. And gosh darn it, when my probation officers did a home visit on her, she was sitting there with her 12-year-old sister teaching her how to shoot heroin. So I remanded her back into custody, and she said, Judge Davis, what for? I said, now you're not only a threat to yourself, you're a threat to your sister. And now I have this wide discretion of what to do with this young senior at Concordia High School. So it's those kind of, I think this is what you're getting at, those kind of decisions, I just have to rely sometimes on my gut after I ask for wisdom, you know, because they're hard. I don't want to release people that are going to hurt other people, you know. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, I guess what I'm curious about is there a particular moral standpoint that you say, okay, this is why I prefer treatment over incarceration?
Oh.
Is there empirical evidence that you say, well, studies have shown that treatment is more effective in terms of getting people off long-term?
Yes and yes. So I personally believe that the more I deal with, you know, prior to taking the bench, I was a prosecutor and I did federals, you know, I was like, if you're breaking the law and you're a felony, you're going to prison. I think going from advocate to decision maker and then seeing this drug epidemic happen in front of me in my courtroom, I've completely changed my personal views as to the low-level addicted offenders, but there's tons of empirical data. That's why we use the phrase evidence-based practices, that what actually happens before I actually sentence them to the program. I get a pre-sentence investigation report that's a really, really detailed report about this individual. So we do a evidence-based risk assessment. So they come out with an objective number like 50, you know, or, you know, it's a numbers game. It tells me whether or not they're ready for rehab, if I need to keep them, if I need to sit them in the jail a little longer, if they, you know, it tells me all I really need to know. So there's definitely objective criteria that I utilize in my courtroom to do all the screening. You know, I do have a screening process. I have an evidence-based tool that my probation officers and pretrial case managers go through, that then they spit out a report and I read those reports. So it's not all just me, Wendy, being smart. It's I read that report, and from that objectively tells me who's ready for treatment, who's not, who should go to treatment, who shouldn't, who has, you know, those objective reports too tell me what their violence range is. So are they in a position where maybe they're in front of me on a nonviolent offense, but they have very violent tendencies. So I know all of that objective criteria before I go to sentence them. Does that help? We don't just shoot from the hip, I promise. We got a lot of laws and a lot of evidence-based tools that kind of help us in the sentencing.
We have time for maybe one more.
Any more questions? Well, you've been a great audience. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Let's thank you. We will come.
Les personnages dans mes tableaux, à me voir vivre en décroché. Mes idées folles devenaient lourdes.